All right, so today we're starting with biological psychology. So basically trying to understand like physically mostly we're focusing on our nervous system. What is our nervous system doing that allows us to think and feel and have beliefs and for me to behave, for me to be up here talking and, giving all this information, like what physically is going on in our brains and our nervous systems that allow for that. Before we get started, I have kind of a metaphor that might help you understand this. How many of you have ever played the game Minecraft? Okay. Of those of you that have played, how many of you have ever messed around with the redstone system? Yes? Anybody want to take a shot for those of us who have never maybe played Minecraft or messed with that? What is the redstone system? How does it work? What does it do?
So it's a very, very, very simple kind of binary logic thing. So you have basically wires that have either an on or an off state. And then there are various other blocks that interact and affect it in various ways. Through that you can make logic gates and other stuff. So for example, if you have two on signals, like a gate, logic gate would essentially be something like what's called an AND gate would be you have two on signals and then you get an on signal. But if you only have one on signal or two off signals, it won't let anything through. The game mechanic employs the concepts of digital logic you'd see in computer science, and using these very fundamental concepts, people have actually built like functioning computers.
Yes.
And all sorts of other stuff.
So basically it's just like this little, like you said, there's all kinds of different components. There's like dust you can lay down that acts kind of like wires. There's redstone torches that you can like click on, they'll turn on and off. There's some like sensory components. So there's one that's like a daylight sensor that you can hook up that if it's bright out, I don't remember, either turn it on or off or whatever. There's a little pressure plate you can put down, and if like you or another mob or whatever steps on it, it'll turn it on. So there are all these little simple pieces, but if you start putting those simple pieces together, you can build some really complicated stuff. So like Alex said, there's people who've built like entire computers within Minecraft. My son plays a lot of Minecraft and he's obsessed with the redstone stuff, and he loves to use it to make all these like complex automated systems. So he makes like whole automated farm systems where like, I don't know, like some, you push one button and it like harvests all his wheat with one button. Or you can make like, like hidden staircases and stuff. You push a button, it'll open a door. So there's all these really simple components, but you start putting those together and you can build something really complicated. So why do you think in a psychology class, when we're talking about biological psychology, I'm up here talking about Minecraft? What the heck does that have to do with anything?
Because there's a correlation between the way that the redstone dust and other factors in that work comparison to the way the brain works and basically makes our body move.
Yeah, exactly. So fundamentally what we're gonna talk about today is this idea that our whole nervous system is made up of all these really simple parts. So if you look at it, a neuron, which we'll talk about in just a minute, is a pretty simple thing. It can basically either be on or off, very similar to like a redstone torch in Minecraft. So any little individual neuron is a very, very simple little, cell in your body. But you start chaining those neurons together in complex ways, and you can get very complicated systems. You can get a visual system that can take in light, just like a daylight sensor in Minecraft can take in light, and then you can use that light to, react and to see things and have perceptions. It creates all of our behavior. So for me to be able to move around or speak or whatever, all of that comes from these very simple little building blocks being put together in really complex, specific ways. So we're going to start kind of broad, zoomed out. We're going to talk about how the nervous system is made of these larger parts. We'll talk about what's called the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. We'll talk about kind of large chunks of the brain, basically. And then we'll zoom in and start talking about those individual cells, the neurons, that make up the entire nervous system. So that's kind of the roadmap for today. So like I said, the nervous system is made up first of these two broad kind of systems. There's the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. And then every other part of the nervous system is part of the peripheral nervous system. So from the spinal cord, there's all these nerves that go and innervate, all of our muscles and things like that, to either receive information from our senses or to send information to our muscles. One of the amazing things about neurons is that they are, they have some pretty extreme and incredible properties. For example, there's a single neuron that stretches all the way from the tip of your toe to your spinal cord. So that's one cell sending its axon across that, entire length. So if you think about a typical cell in your body and how tiny they are, for one cell to kind of traverse that entire length is pretty amazing. So again, central nervous system is brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system is everything else. We'll first start by talking just very briefly about the peripheral nervous system, and then we'll talk quite a bit more about the brain. So the peripheral nervous system is further broken down into two different systems. There's what's called the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And the job of the sympathetic nervous system is basically to increase our level of arousal. When I say the word arousal in this context, I mean overall, your level of awakeness, right? Like right now, you're just kind of sitting there. Maybe some of you are a little bit bored. Your arousal level might be pretty low, but I'm up here talking and moving around. My arousal level is a little bit higher. So that's what I mean by arousal in this case. So sympathetic nervous system basically increases that level. It's kind of like the gas pedal on our arousal system. It's particularly active whenever we're in a fight or flight response. So if there's something that you perceive as even a little bit threatening, that sympathetic nervous system is going to be very active. And basically everything it does to the body is to prepare the body for that kind of threatening state. So let's say, for example, a bear just barreled through the window right now into the classroom. What physically do you think your body would be doing if something like that happened, if all of a sudden there's this threatening thing in the classroom? Obviously, you would probably get up and run, but what would your body be doing as you feel that fear?
You get pumped full of adrenaline, and generally your whole, without even thinking about it, your heart rate would go up. You'd be getting prepared to deal with the pains of running and everything without even thinking about it. That's just going to be happening in the background.
Yes, exactly. So automatically your body's going to start pumping blood very quickly to your muscles so that you can run more effectively or fight. If you want to fight a bear, I guess you could. It's going to do a bunch of other things though too. It's going to, for example, dilate your pupils so that you can bring in more light, so that you can see more clearly to punch the bear in the face or whatever. It's going to constrict your bladder and or not constrict, it's going to inhibit your bladder and your digestive system so that all those resources can then be devoted to your muscles, again, so that you can more effectively run away or fight. So sympathetic nervous system, basically getting your body prepared to deal with a threatening situation. Oftentimes we will have sympathetic activity when it doesn't necessarily make sense. So in a little bit, when I give you a quiz, some of you who maybe have testing anxiety, you might start to feel a little bit of that sympathetic arousal, even though you shouldn't see this quiz as threatening. Your body might sort of activate that system. Your heart rate, might go up. You might start sweating, things like that. The parasympathetic nervous system does the opposite. So it basically decreases your arousal level and prepares your body for relaxation. So most of you probably have mostly parasympathetic activity going on right now. So, all of these, the sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system, they innervate the same organs. So they're both going to innervate your eyes and your bladder and all these different, muscles or whatever. They just have very different effects on those organs. So that's one of the main roles of the peripheral system. I didn't put it up here too much because we're going to talk about it more in the context of sensation and perception, but there's also another part of your peripheral nervous system that is bringing in information from your sensory organs, like from your eyes, from your skin, from your ears, etc. Okay, so that's the peripheral nervous system. So let's head back to the central nervous system, which again, central nervous system is the brain and the spine. The brain is the most complex organ in our body. Some people argue that the brain is the most complex thing in the world or whatever. I don't know if I buy into that belief necessarily, but it is a very, very complicated structure. So again, to try to describe it in 30 minutes or less is a little bit difficult. But these are kind of the main things I want you to think about when you think about the structure of the brain. Number one is that it's not just some homogeneous organ. Instead, it's split up into lots of different parts, and all of those parts have different jobs. So we talked a little bit last time about kind of the metaphor between like the brain and a computer, and that metaphor is, pretty accurate. So if you open up your computer, you'll see all these different parts like graphics cards and whatever. The brain kind of functions very similarly, where you have these different components that all have different jobs. And in general, the brain is composed in these layers, kind of like an onion is how I like to think of it. And the deepest, most inner parts of that onion are devoted to like automatic processes, mostly processes that are involved in just keeping us alive. So one of the deepest parts of the brain is the brainstem, which is kind of like here basically. And again, this is very deep. It basically just sits right on top of the spinal cord. It's the deepest part of the brain. And that controls things like our heart rate and our breathing. If you had damage to your brainstem, what do you think would happen? Yes, you would most likely die. Best case scenario, you'd be in like a brain dead coma for a period of time until you then die. So damaging the brainstem would be very bad because again, it controls heart rate and breathing. Wrapped around that is the midbrain, which controls, sort of like a little bit higher level functioning. As you start to go out to these outer layers, you eventually get to the limbic system, which controls things like emotion. So sometimes the limbic system is referred to as the lizard brain. If any of you ever heard that phrase. So it's called the lizard brain because it's one of the systems that was evolved around the time that like amphibians and reptiles would have started evolving. And it's mostly in control of like emotions. Then as you get to the very outer part, the forebrain, and the cortex is kind of like the wrinkly part that you probably think of if you just like picture a brain. If I asked you to draw one, you would probably draw, kind of this squiggly, wrinkly outer structure. The cortex is more important for like conscious perception and thought. So any conscious thought that you have, the fact that you can see right now and you're consciously aware that there's a PowerPoint up here and I'm talking, you might have thoughts in your head about, thinking about the things I'm saying. All those conscious pieces, those are happening in the cortex. One of the kind of, bigger philosophical things that should hopefully make you think about is that, a huge part of our brain is everything under the cortex. So the brainstem, the limbic system, all that stuff makes up, a really large proportion of our brain. And all of that is unconscious processing. It's doing processing that we know absolutely nothing about. We have no awareness of whatsoever. And then only a little sliver of the activity of our brain is on that outer part that we're consciously aware of. So most of your thoughts or, most of what your brain is processing and doing, you have no awareness of. We might get more into the implications of that later. If we have time, we'll see. Okay, so you've got this kind of onion-y structure. The outer part of the onion, the cortex, is split into 4 different lobes. And each of these lobes kind of basically contribute to different types of functioning. So at the very back of the brain, you have what's called the occipital lobe. And the occipital lobe is mostly processing visual information. Again, something we'll talk about a little bit more when we get into sensation and perception, but it's processing visual information. If you've ever hit the back of your head really hard, like fallen over or something, and you see stars or twinkling, that's because you're basically forcing your occipital lobe to be active through that pressure. And so then your brain thinks oh, I'm seeing all these stars because my occipital lobe is active, when really it's just, the physical pressure of it. The parietal lobe, which sits kind of in front of and on top of the occipital lobe, is mostly important for motor activity and what's called somatosensation, which is basically your perception of touch. Temporal lobe sits kind of, close to the temple. That's why it's called the temporal lobe. And it's mostly important for processing auditory information. It's particularly important for language. So in order to understand language and to speak language, there's a lot of activity in the temporal lobe involved in that. And then the frontal lobe, as the name implies, is at the very front, and it's really responsible for really higher order, thinking, reasoning, decision-making. Also controls a little bit of our personality overall, basically, how, hot-tempered we might be, things like that. So again, that's kind of simplified, but, the basic role of each of those lobes. And then in addition to that, it's not shown here, but if you were to look at the brain from the front instead of from the side, it's pretty obviously split into two sides. So you have the left and the right. How many of you ever heard anything about being like left-brained or right-brained? Right, so that's a pretty common like kind of pop psyche thing that you might hear. In general, I would say a lot of that stuff is BS, or tends to be. Most people are not either right-brained or left-brained unless you have some sort of brain damage or some sort of abnormality. You should be getting lots of activity from both hemispheres of the brain. But kind of the logic of where that comes from is that the left brain and the right brain do tend to specialize in different things. So the left hemisphere is really important for language, especially for like what we typically think of when we think of language, like the grammatical aspects, understanding the meaning. The right side is more important for like the prosody or the rhythm of language. So it does play a role, but not so much in like the meaning. Left side tends to do things that are seen as more like logical or analytical, and right side kind of tends to do things that are creative. So that's where that distinction comes from. But again, most healthy people, you're going to get lots of activity from both hemispheres of the brain. You don't necessarily have a strength or weakness in one side or the other. Okay, any questions so far about kind of all these different components we're talking about? All right, again, main thing to get is just, it's made of all these different layers and structures, and all the structures are kind of doing something different. Okay, so then let's zoom in and talk about the individual cells that make up this nervous system. So here we're talking about the entire nervous system is made of these cells called neurons, so the brain, the spinal cord, the peripheral nervous system. This is, really kind of the standard neuron picture that most people often see. I will say that not every single neuron looks like this. You can get all kinds of neurons that have really bizarre shapes and structures that are very different from this. We'll see an example of that later today. But this is kind of, the basic components that most neurons have. So all neurons are going to have a soma, or a cell body. It's kind of the main chunk here. And that functions pretty similarly to any other cell in your body. So it's going to have a nucleus that has the DNA. It's going to have like mitochondria and ribosomes and all those parts you would have learned in biology or whatever. And it's basically doing like the metabolic function of the cell. So it's bringing in oxygen and glucose, keeping the cell alive, basically. Attached to the soma, there often will be dendrites, which are these kind of branchy structures that radiate all around the soma. And the role of the dendrites is basically just to receive information. Usually that information is going to come from another neuron. So you can kind of see it in this picture. There's like the tail of another neuron connecting to the dendrites, sending information. Sometimes those dendrites are receiving information from the environment. So they might be taking in like photons of light, or they might be receiving pressure, on your skin or whatever. But they're always receiving information from something. So that information goes to the dendrite, goes to the soma, and then eventually makes its way to the axon. The axon is the long tail-like structure. The axon and the dendrites are going to be two things that are going to vary quite a bit from one neuron to another. So one neuron might have like lots of really complex dendrites. Others might not have any dendrites at all. Kind of the same with the axon. Some might have really long ones, like that one I talked about that goes from your toe to your spinal cord. That's just one really long axon, basically. Others basically might not have an axon at all. So it just kind of depends on the particular function of the cell. But the job of the axon is to send information. So dendrites receive the information, goes to the soma, and then that information is going to go all the way down the axon and eventually make it to the end of the axon, which is called the terminal buttons. And then the axon sometimes might be covered in this fatty substance called myelin. So myelin are these sheets of, like fatty material that basically insulate the axon. So it's kind of like having, like insulation on a wire or whatever. It basically helps kind of keep the electrical charge inside the axon so it's not leaking out, and it makes it function faster. So again, some neurons will have myelin, some of them will not. Yes?
So with the neurons with myelin, are they usually located in specific areas? I'm kind of imagining, having no real understanding, or not really knowing where I'm getting this from, that the ones in the brain, like this massive clusters of neurons,
right,
they would be the ones without myelin because they're trying to pack as many of them as together, or is it the other way around?
No, not necessarily. So the myelin is mostly based on the function of the neuron, and there are definitely, lots of neurons in the brain that are myelinated, not all of them, but a lot of them. So basically, anytime you want really fast communication, which is most of the time, you're going to have myelin. There are instances where, like, for example, we'll talk a little bit about pain later, but not in this much detail. If you think about, like, pain, right? You felt pain. We've all felt physical pain, right? And there's lots of different kinds of pain. Like, there's, like, a sharp stabbing pain that's you can kind of perceive it as being like fast, right? It's like if I stab myself with something, I'm going to feel that immediately, and it usually is going to fade pretty quickly. There's a more like slow pain, like if I hit my thumb with a hammer or something, and it's kind of like throbbing, and like the pain builds up more slowly. That actually has to do with, the level of myelination on those neurons, like how quickly those neurons are communicating information. But in the brain, I would say probably most of them have myelin. Yeah.
Is the myelin also what's referred to as like the blood-brain barrier, or is that something different?
That is something different. So the blood-brain barrier is made of like endothelial cells or whatever. It's kind of similar to like the what makes up your arteries and your veins. And in the blood-brain barrier, I mean, it basically is the same as veins. It's just packed more tightly so that stuff can't get through there. Yeah, great questions. Anything else? Okay. So again, just think about the fact, these are fairly simple. I mean, it is a living cell, right? So it's got all the complexity of a living cell, all those parts I talked about, nucleus, mitochondria, whatever, plus these parts that kind of make it like a neuron. But, at its core, it's a pretty simple thing. It receives stimulation. If it gets enough stimulation, then it'll basically turn on, and it'll fire what's called an action potential. Okay, so it'll basically just light up. You can just imagine it like, if something stimulates this enough, then there's going to be this electrical signal that goes from the soma to the terminal. So it's either going to do that or it's not. It's either on or it's off, very similar to a redstone torch, okay? And again, this is what makes up, all of your thoughts and perceptions. The most important piece of information that a neuron sends is basically the pattern of firing that it does. So again, let me give you kind of a metaphor. Let's say for whatever reason, I decided that none of you are allowed to talk, and you have to communicate some kind of message to me using only the light switch in the classroom. How would you try to do that?
Morse code.
Yeah, that'd probably be the easiest thing, right? You basically just turn the light on and off at a certain pattern and hope that I know Morse code, which I don't, so it'd fail. But if I learned it, then it would work really well, right? But if you just turn that light on and off in a very specific pattern, then that's going to communicate a message potentially to me, right? So that's essentially what neurons are doing. They're using almost like a Morse code system. Again, very overly simplified, but it's a decent metaphor. It's just the pattern of when they're on and when they're off, how quickly they're firing on and off, sends a bunch of information, sort of the conglomeration of all of those different firings basically then allows me to interpret something about the world. So again, this may be getting a little philosophical, but something I want you to think about, especially over the next few weeks that we're talking about, like mostly cognitive psychology stuff. Our perception of the world, we often kind of take it for granted that that's just like reality, right? That like I'm holding this pen, I can feel it, it feels hard and flexible, I can see all these colors or whatever, and that must be the state of the real world. But just keep in mind that your perception of reality is basically like a bunch of lights communicating with you through Morse code. So there's a lot of information that we lose in that process, and our brains are just constantly making interpretations. So we have to take all this really vague information and try to make sense of it, and most of the time we're probably right, but a lot of times we're not, okay? One of the things we'll do next Thursday, is do an assignment involving a lot of different visual illusions. And hopefully, if what I'm saying right now makes absolutely no sense to you, hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense. We'll kind of come back to that idea next Thursday when we do that assignment. Okay, so those are kind of all the parts of the neuron. Then let's kind of zoom in. So let me go back. My Mac is refusing to go back because I'm recording and it hates to go backwards. But in that previous slide, there was the neuron and there was kind of in the background like another neuron that you could sort of barely see. We're sort of zooming in on the connection between those two neurons. So this is the end of one neuron, like that axon terminal button thing. And then this would be the dendrite of a second neuron that we're looking at here. And so this is called the synapse. The synapse is that connection between two neurons where communication takes place, where they send information to each other. So in the axon, so if we could zoom out and we were up here, there's an electrical impulse that goes from the axon down to this terminal button. Once it reaches here, then it basically converts that electricity into a chemical communication. Okay? And the way it does that is through these chemicals called neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are just this broad class of molecules that basically are released by a neuron and they affect another neuron. They have a lot of properties similar to hormones. In fact, there are some molecules that, depending on where they're at in your body, we call them a hormone, but if they're in another place in your body, we call it a neurotransmitter. So they're very similar in the way that they function. But basically, whenever that electrical impulse gets here, it's going to force these neurotransmitters to release into the synapse. And then those neurotransmitters are going to bind to these little receptor things on the dendrite of the second neuron. And basically, this process is kind of like a lock and a key. So you can kind of think of the neurotransmitter as like a key, and the receptor's like a lock, and it's going to open a door, essentially. Okay? So electrical impulse comes down, forces the neurotransmitter to go into the synapse. And then the synapse, or the neurotransmitter, acts like a key that's going to open this receptor. When it opens that receptor, it allows electricity basically now to flow into that second neuron. So now you've got kind of this message jumping from one neuron to another. Okay? Any questions about that process? That part was there's a lot of detail I could go into about it, and it's difficult to avoid going into it, but yeah,
so how
Alex.
does the type of neurotransmitter affect the process? Because I'm imagining neurons, I'm thinking, okay, we're just having on-off signals, but then you're having different kinds of electricity. Yes. How does that work?
So one of the biggest ways is that some neurotransmitters are what are called excitatory, and some are inhibitory. So I give you a very oversimplified picture here. The picture I just described would be like a neurotransmitter called glutamate, which glutamate is excitatory. So if glutamate gets released, it does what I just said. It opens this door. It lets the electricity in. There are other neurotransmitters that are inhibitory. So there's one called GABA. If GABA gets into the synapse, instead of being like a key that opens the lock, it's more like putting gum in the lock. So it blocks it so nothing else can open it. So now it can't fire anymore. So that's one of the main ways, is just whether it's excitatory or inhibitory. And then there's all kinds of very specific details for each neurotransmitter that's probably beyond the scope of this class that I could get into. But yeah, if you're really interested.
So is dopamine a neurotransmitter? Or
yes.
Okay.
Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter. You might have heard of oxytocin, another neurotransmitter. And yeah, those all have very specific roles. Another thing is like certain neurotransmitters are going to be concentrated in certain parts of the brain. So dopamine, you mostly only find that in what's called the reward circuitry sometimes. It's basically the part of the brain that allows you to feel pleasure. So that's why it's so like coupled with like addiction and depression and things like that. So different neurotransmitters are concentrated in different parts of the brain. And they have, they have really, really complex, interactions and things depending on which neurotransmitter it is. Each neurotransmitter also has lots of different receptors. So, it's not just affecting one receptor. There's all different kinds. So, yeah, we could take, entire semester-long courses on just neurotransmitters and still not know everything about them. Good question, though. Any other questions? Kind of main thing I want you to get from this slide, because I know there was a lot of details there, just know that the synapse is the part where neurons communicate, and that they do it by releasing neurotransmitters into the synapse. Those neurotransmitters affect receptors on the next neuron.